American national government. This is Dr. Patrick Stewart. Chapter 3, Federalism. The learning objectives for this segment is to understand the different types of power-sharing arrangements in governmental systems. Secondly, to appreciate the historical roots of conflict between the nationalist approach and the local approach. And finally, consider the structure of government at the state level and understand how that influences outcomes. Now, in understanding government, probably the best approach is to understand the very poles. On the one hand, we have the confederal system. With the confederal system, what we see is that the power derives from the state levels and are directed upwards to one overarching body. Now, the unitary system, on the other hand, has a national government, and it has power over all subnational governments. All examples of this would be considered actually within the United Nations. Here we have a very large entity. Indeed, what we find is that the United Nations has 193 nation states. Likewise, the European Union can be considered a confederation, although, as we see, abiding by this is voluntary, especially as we saw with Brexit as Great Britain pulled away from the European Union. At the same time, when we consider the unitary system, Great Britain is a great example as well, because the power derives from the Parliament, although originally it came from the Crown. While there is a certain amount of power at the local level, indeed, most authority derives itself from the national level. Now, in understanding the approach that America take, we have to understand that the federal system is structured based upon a political document, the Constitution. In other words, here we have state government and national government that have specific roles that they play and have different authority based upon this document. With the federal system, we find that each level of government is independent from the other. Now, it's not something that we just see in the United States, but we also see in other nations, including Canada to our north with its provinces, Switzerland with their cantons, as well as Germany with their Länder. Now, understanding the American experience, one has to understand a couple of our founding fathers and their very different views towards this. On the one hand, we have Alexander Hamilton, who is a nationalist and a federalist. On the other hand, Thomas Jefferson, who is a localist and an anti-federalist. Now, Hamilton's views was that you needed a strong and powerful government to counter very strong mercantilist and business interests. In other words, the individual rights needed to be protected against larger organizations in the economic world. Now, this is likely due to his background. He was an individual who was born in the West Indies of a laird, as well as a divorced woman, and he was orphaned at a very young age. Despite this, he was able to work his way through the trade system and found himself traveling throughout the world, the Caribbean, the United States, and of course, Great Britain. Now, on the other hand, we had Thomas Jefferson. Now, his views can be considered the very epitome of agrarian virtues, because he values distance from central government, and he sees this as serving personal liberty. Indeed, he saw that the concentration of economic and political power was stifling for individual freedom. Now, Jefferson's view of government can be encapsulated in what he said. It is not by the consolidation or concentration of powers, but by their distribution that good government is effected. In other words, his views were very much those of localists, and this is probably shaped by his background. He was born to a prominent plantation family and was likely very powerful throughout his life and saw a government as infringing on his ability to engage in the economic interests that he had control of. Now, these views of these two different individuals, these founding fathers, came into conflict with McCulloch versus Maryland in 1819. Here, the U.S. Supreme Court interpreted the Necessary and Proper Clause of Article 1, Section 8 as allowing Congress to create a national bank to safeguard national funds. Hamilton's interpretation of necessary as appropriate was chosen over Jefferson's interpretation of necessary as indispensable. Indeed, of the dueling visions, Hamilton is the one who won. Now, the state governments in the United States are the only subnational governments that are recognized by the U.S. Constitution. And when we consider the growth of this nation from 13 to 50 states, we see that there's a amount of power that is given to each one of them independently, and it hasn't changed over the years. Now, ultimately, what we see with this system are two different approaches. The first approach asserts that each level has power directly granted by the Constitution. And the second aspect of this is that each level possesses and exercises power that is legally distinct from and independent of the other. Now, both federal and state governments can exercise powers concurrently. In other words, they both have the ability to tax and to borrow money. However, when we consider the states themselves, they have police power. Indeed, they are the only ones who are allowed to pass laws for the health, safety, and morals of their citizens according to the 10th Amendment, although there have been changes over the years. When we consider federalism, there are specific advantages and disadvantages that are connected with each other. The first is that of the dispersal of power. Indeed, this was one of the key factors in structuring the system as a federal system. Our founding fathers, and many of those who lived in the colonies, and indeed to this day, consider the centralization of power just a recipe for tyranny. Therefore, they prefer to have the power separated into different subnational units. On the other hand, when we look at this tyranny certainly might not be centralized, but local factions controlling state and local government still can engage in tyranny at the local level. So we're not necessarily able to get away from this completely. Now, there's also an accommodation of diverse interests when we look at federalism. Specifically, each state addresses issues that are specific to its environment. There's a local context that's influenced by the environmental, economic, and social factors that influences how people interact. As a result, the states have different approaches to dealing with their citizens as they try to adapt to these contexts. This in turn allows for a level of policy experimentation as each of the states become laboratories of democracy and try new public policies that might actually benefit all states throughout the nation. Now, at the same time, as there is the ability to try new things, this slack, leads to a high level of complexity, indeed inefficiency in governing. Indeed, one might consider this inefficiency as what leads to innovation in the first place. At the same time, difficulty in assigning accountability comes about because there are multiple governmental layers involved. In other words, you don't know who to hold the blame when things go wrong or who to give credit to when things go right. Now, with each of the states, there's a constitution that's built to a certain extent on the federal constitution, although one might argue that the federal constitution was built upon the original 13 colonies. Now, every state constitution has a Bill of Rights, and it provides for executive, legislative, and judicial branches. However, state constitutions tend to be negative, and they restrict what the states can do. Indeed, because they are restrictive documents, they may be seen as impeding states that are confronting complex modern problems that do not consider that these issues go across state boundaries. So let's take a look at the executive branch. Now, governors tend to have less power than in the past due to judicial review by the Supreme Court, as well as historic and political factors. However, There's substantial power and stature in this office. Indeed, many governors attempt to use this office as a means to obtain the highest office in the land, the President of the United States. Now, major indicators of gubernatorial power? Certainly, the size of the state's population and economy can have an influence on the power that the governor holds, especially when you have large states such as Illinois, Florida, Texas, California, and New York that have foreign policy and consulates in different nations, and different nations have consulates specifically to deal with those states. Now, structurally, the power of the governor may be influenced by whether they are elected alone or if there are multiple different executive officials that are elected at the same time. If you're able to appoint all the people on your board, certainly you have much more power than those who are elected in their own right and serve in different offices. Term limits, likewise, has an influence on the amount of power a governor has. If you have an unlimited amount of time in the gubernatorial office, you can accrue an awful lot of power and knowledge. And lastly, veto power is an incredible power that may be utilized. In states such as North Carolina and North Dakota, governors do not have the power to veto bills, but all other states have this power. Indeed, some states give the governors the ability to line item veto portions of appropriation bills. In other words, governors have the ability to take a scalpel to parts of appropriations bills and cut out spending on specific issues and policies. Now, the legislative branch has historically been powerful and respected. However, due to bribes and corruption, this respect diminished, but it has been growing in recent years. This is due to a variety of factors, including reapportionment, in which these state representatives more accurately reflect the populations that have moved from the rural areas to the more suburban and urban areas. Professionalization, especially amongst state legislators, has increased, and this has led to increased respect as well. However, at the same time, it is a part-time job in most states, and it pays a mere pittance in comparison with other professional jobs. Indeed, this might lead to the problem that only those who are independently wealthy can afford to represent the public that they may not represent. Finally, modern facilities and procedures certainly have an influence on the ability of the legislative branch to get things done. Now, ultimately, when we look at most of the states, with one exception, Nebraska, they have two houses. Here, senators tend to serve longer terms, typically 4-year terms, while representatives serve 2-year terms. And the size of these legislatures, well, they tend to range an awful lot, from 49 to 424 individuals. Finally, the judicial branch has the ability to strike down state laws and thus has an incredible amount of power. And most state judges that are elected are done so at high cost and political intensity due to the power and prestige attached to these offices. Ultimately, when we consider federalism and any form of government, the one thing that we can take away from this is structure matters. American national government.